Okay, so now that you know all there is to know about the different types of tissues and connective and epithelial tissues and all of that sort of thing, let's talk about where they come from, how they change, how they fix themselves when they get hurt, and eventually how they die. That's the theme of this lecture: tissue growth, development, and repair. So tissues can grow in a couple of different ways. If you recall from our lecture on mitosis and the cell cycle, cells can reproduce. They can divide, and that's one way that they can grow. Or new cells can be recruited in. Those are all different types of ways to grow. So tissue growth literally means increasing the number of cells or the size of existing cells. So if you increase the size or the number, the tissue's growing. It just means you're getting more of it. Hyperplasia is growth through cell multiplication. Anytime you see plasia, that means that cell division of some type is going on. So hyperplasia is growth through cell multiplication. Usually that means that the cells are mitosing. Either the cells of the tissue are mitosing, or you have stem cells, which we'll talk about in just a second, that are going through mitosis, and then those resulting cells, the daughter cells, are then adding on to the tissue. Trophy. Trophy means like to eat or to absorb. So hypertrophy is tissue growth through the cells enlarging. You don't have more cells, but the cells are getting bigger. A good example of this is you go to the gym to buff up and get swole, and you're lifting your weights, you're lifting a whole lot, your muscles get bigger. You're not making any more muscle cells, right? The number of muscle cells that you have is pretty much set. There are a few circumstances under which you make new muscle cells, but that isn't what's happening here. What's happening is that the muscle cells that you have are getting bigger. They are undergoing hypertrophy. The opposite of going to the gym is, of course, going to the buffet. And you can also get swole that way. It's a different type of swole. And your fat cells will undergo hypertrophy and get larger as they absorb fat. Both hyperplasia and hypertrophy are normal processes for the body. Neoplasia, neo means new, and so this is called new growth. This is the growth of something in an area where it is not supposed to be growing. That's a tumor. Tumors can be benign or malignant. Benign tumors aren't necessarily not dangerous, but at least they're not cancer, or at least they're not cancer yet. It means that you've got a lump of cells that are reproducing out of control, but they're all in one place, and they may be reproducing pretty slowly. A malignant neoplasia is a cancer. It means that not only are the cells replicating out of control, but they've started spreading. Neoplasias are not intentional. They're when your body stops working normally. So they're usually composed of abnormal, non-functional tissue. So where does tissue come from? Well, all cells come from other cells. And ultimately, for the most part, your cells come from what are called stem cells. You don't want most of the cells in your body reproducing, right? Cells that can reproduce have the capability to start reproducing out of control and therefore become cancerous. So you don't want most of the cells of your body to be capable of reproducing. It would increase the rate at which people get cancers, and that's not good, right? We've been selected against that. So most of your cells just concentrate on being cells. And then you have special cells that are specialized in reproducing. And those are called stem cells. Now, stem cells can come in several different shapes and sizes. All of your body comes from a special type of stem cell called a totipotent stem cell. You may have heard these called embryonic stem cells. Stem cells start off as generalists, other than that they're specialized in division, and then they can specialize in down increasingly more narrow paths as they develop. This is called differentiation. I like to think of it as kind of like the process that a student goes through as they go through university, right? So you start off and your first day is freshman, or maybe you aren't even your first day as your freshman. You just got your first, appointment with an enrollment counselor, and you have many paths ahead of you. Right? There's lots of different paths that you could take. You could go into psychology, or business, or medicine, or geology, or English literature. There's so many different paths that you can take, and maybe you take a bunch of different, classes from a bunch of different subjects. But eventually, they're going to ask you to pick a major. All right? Let's say you've decided, all right, I'm going to be a biologist. All right? So you're majoring in biology. You've differentiated. You've undergone that first differentiation. You are now more specialized. You still have a whole bunch of different things that you can do, but it's a more restricted list. So you started off, you could become anything. Now you're majoring in biology. You could go into medicine. You could go into environmental biology. You could go into laboratory science. You've got a bunch of stuff that you can still do. Then, you graduate with your degree in biology. It's time to go, okay, I want to go to nursing school, or I want to go to medical school, or I want to go to grad school, or I want to go to PA school, or something like that. You got to differentiate again. Become even more specialized. All right, so I'm going to go to medical school. So now, you're a biologist, and you're set on the path towards becoming a doctor. You graduate, you get your medical degree. Now you got to pick what your specialty is going to be. You got to specialize again. So each time you specialize, each time you differentiate, the list of things that you can become becomes more and more narrow until there's only one thing that you can become. So you've got, you start off with totipotent stem cells, which are like embryonic stem cells. They can become anything that they want. And I'll get to that in just a second. Generally speaking, stem cells are considered immature cells, or at least not totally mature, and they specialize as they go down. A metaplasia, remember, there's that plasia word again. Anytime you have plasia, it's going to be some sort of cell division. This is when one type of mature tissue changes into another type of mature tissue. This is fairly uncommon. Usually you don't have one type of cell changing to another type of cell. It does happen in a few specific cases. Usually it's going to be very closely related cell types. So for instance, cuboidal tissue in the vagina before puberty, under the influence of estrogens and progesterone, changed to stratified squamous after puberty. You're changing from one epithelial type to another epithelial type. It's not a huge leap. Pseudostratified columnar cells in smokers, the damage actually causes them to turn into stratified squamous cells to sort of try to contain the damage. That's a response to the damage from smoking. But again, it's one type of epithelial cell to another type of epithelial cell. You're unlikely to see like a nerve cell suddenly turn into a muscle cell or something like that. That doesn't happen. So stem cells. As we go through our life, starting from a fertilized egg and going to adulthood, when you're an embryo, and an embryo means the first few weeks of life before any sort of differentiation has happened, your stem cells are totipotent, meaning that they can turn into anything. Very, very early embryo cells are totipotent. Then they undergo their first level of specialization. They turn into endoderm, exoderm, and mesoderm stem cells. And like your exoderm turns into nerve tissue and skin tissue and eye tissue and hair and nails. And your endoderm turns into your like internal organs. And the mesoderm becomes most of your connective tissues. And they further specialize. So pluripotent, these would be pluripotent. That means that you can become many different types of cells, but not all different types of cells. So a pluripotent can develop into any type of cell in the embryo, but not the accessory organs of pregnancy. Then you can have, and pluripotent stem cells are only found in the embryo as well. Then you have adult stem cells, and for our purposes, adult means you've been born. From a development point of view, when you're born, you've pretty much done all the developing that you're going to do. Like, yeah, you're going to turn from like a tiny person into a much bigger person, but from a cellular perspective, going from like one cell to something that's shaped kind of like a person is a much bigger step. In adult stem cells, you have multipotent stem cells. That means that there is more than one thing that they can turn into. They can turn into 2 or more cell lines. So, for example, bone marrow stem cells, when they divide, they can turn into more bone marrow stem cells, or they can turn into a bunch of different types of blood cells. Turn into red blood cells, they can turn into leukocytes, macrophages, lymphocytes, all of those different things, all the different blood cells. Some are unipotent. That means that they can produce only one cell type other than themselves. So when they divide, they can turn into another stem cell, or they can turn into one other thing. And you will often see anything with a blast after it is going to be some sort of unipotent stem cell. So there are sperm stem cells. They can divide and they can turn into sperm. There are myoblasts. When they divide, they can turn into other myoblasts, or they can turn into muscle cells. There are neuroblasts that when they divide, they can turn into neuroblasts, or they can turn into neurons. There are fibroblasts that when they divide, they can turn into more fibroblasts, or they can turn into mostly fibroblasts, actually. When tissue is damaged, it can be repaired. Like, it's a good thing that your body can repair itself because you screw it up on a fairly regular basis. There are 2 ways that your body can be repaired. There's the good way and the bad way. Regeneration's the good way, and regeneration's awesome, but unfortunately only a few tissues in your body can do this. So with regeneration, what you have is the same type of tissue that was damaged is replaced. And at the end of regeneration, you should have basically the same functionality that you had before. But few types of tissue can fully regenerate. Most epithelial tissues can regenerate. Connective tissues typically can't. So your liver can regenerate, which is good because most of us like damaging our liver on a regular basis. And they can, at least minor damage to the liver, can be regenerated. Major damage to the liver can't be regenerated and has to be repaired through fibrosis. Fibrosis is scarification. This is where you replace damaged cells. You've got this set of damaged cells. Your body's going to replace it with scar tissue. All right? The scar tissue is kind of like glue. It's going to hold you back together, but it doesn't do any of the functional aspects of the tissue before. So, for instance, if you get, some drugs can cause liver scarification, hepatitis, right? And once your liver starts to develop these fibrosis scars, right, so they're going to hold the liver together so that your liver doesn't just like leak blood all over the place, but that scar tissue doesn't function like a liver. So the more scar tissue you obtain in your liver, the less functional your liver becomes. If you have tuberculosis or you're a smoker, you begin to accumulate scar tissue in your lungs, and it'll hold your lungs together, but it doesn't absorb oxygen. So the more scar tissue you have in your lungs, the less oxygen absorbing your lungs can do. So we're going to look at an example of tissue repair. It's going to involve some regeneration and some fibrosis. We're going to look at a skin wound here. So this lady here has unfortunately cut herself with this kitchen knife. She's stabbed her finger, and you can see that it has gone through the top layer of epithelium, the epidermis, and into this layer of connective tissue, the dermis below, and she's stabbed into this minor like arterial or something, this minor blood vessel, right? There's a few things that happen right away. First off, you have guard cells around here called mast cells, and they can detect when tissue damage has happened, and they will release a chemical called histamine. Histamine is called your body's alarmone. It's not exactly a hormone, but it's a chemical signal that says danger, 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 danger. It means something has gone horribly wrong. You secrete histamine when you're infected or injured or something like that. And histamine begins to mobilize your repair process and your immune system. And it's good because, like, there could have been bacteria or something on that knife she stabbed herself with, so you want the immune system to be there as well. Histamine, the first thing that it does is it's going to dilate blood vessels, so the blood vessels get bigger. So blood vessel going to get bigger. There's a few reasons for that. First off, bigger blood vessel carries more blood. If it carries more blood, that means you got more oxygen, more nutrients. You're going to need those for the repair process, and you're bringing in more white blood cells to help heal you, or to help prevent infections. The blood plasma carries antibodies, clotting proteins, and these are things that you need. In addition to making the blood vessel bigger, it's also going to make it more permeable, so things can leak out of here easier. And specifically, those antibodies and clotting proteins and white blood cells can leak out of there and into the surrounding tissue and start their repair process. So step 2, your blood clots and you form a scab, right? So you have here a blood clot in this area there. And then on the surface, you have a scab. A scab is basically a dried out, hardened blood clot. A blood clot is, we'll get into this in greater detail next semester when we cover the blood. But basically, it's going to be a fibrous mesh. All of these potential fibers in your blood become actual fibers, and they form this huge mesh network that traps these cell fragments called platelets and stop, like they bind the tissue, the cut tissue together, and they stop blood from being able to leak out. So they seal the wound, they prevent more pathogens from getting in, and you had a wound here, so you've got lots of dead cells and debris and crap that got in, and you have macrophages. Macrophages are your body's cops and garbage men. That's one job in your body. And they come by and they eat stuff. They eat dead bits of cells, they eat debris, damaged proteins. They also eat any infectious particles that got in. They're a part of your immune system. So step 2 is scab formation. Step 3 is the formation of granular tissue. All right. So the blood clot lasts for a few days. Signals from these surrounding area here begin to recruit fibroblasts and blood vessels. So fibroblasts come in and they lay down basically extracellular matrix. They lay down connective tissue, collagen for the most part, and they start filling in this blood clot area with this connective tissue called granulation tissue. And they need energy to do that, so local blood vessels will be stimulated to put off capillary branches to this area that will carry blood cells and nutrients and the fibroblasts to this area. And as we go along, the macrophages will start eating the blood clot, and as the blood clot is slowly eaten away, fibroblasts replace it with this fibrous granulation tissue. So this starts at 3 to 4 days, depending on the size of the wound, and it can last for several weeks. And the last phase, so you've got your granulation tissue that was up here. Your epithelial cells are capable of regeneration. So your macrophages will eat away the fibrous connective granular tissue here, and your epithelial stem cells will divide to make more epithelial cells to basically fill in the gap, and that will regenerate. You won't be able to tell the difference between, you probably won't be able to tell much of a difference between the new skin and the old skin. The new skin might be lighter, like it hasn't been exposed to as much sun and stuff like that, but it regenerates basically perfectly functionally. You had these really long cables that your body set up in this, in the connective tissue while you were growing. You cut a bunch of those cables. You've now bound them together, basically tying the loose ends of the cables together, but you can't replace all of the cables. You can just kind of patch it. And so this fourth phase is epithelial regeneration and connective fibrosis. So your epithelium regenerates and connective tissue forms this scar tissue. After the formation of the granular tissue, you start remodeling. Basically, your cells go to work trying to reconnect the ends of these protein fibers as much as they can, trying to make it resemble the original tissue as much as possible. And for some scars, like really small scars, it may eventually be able to get it to the point where you can't really tell the difference, and scars gradually fade. But for larger scars or in older people, your body basically just gets to the point where it's patched it up It's kind of like tied off the ends, and it just goes, all right, that's good enough. We're going to leave it there. So remodeling begins after that 2-week period, and it can last up to the rest of your life. And it will continue to get better and better and better over time, but over time you get diminishing returns. So tissues can also die, and this is a normal part of the body. Death is a normal part of life. You actually have to have cells capable of dying in order for your body to survive. There are several different ways that tissues can die, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them here. The first is atrophy. Atrophy is the death or shrinkage of tissue due to either disuse or age. And just like growth can be either cells get bigger or you get more cells, atrophy could be cells shrink or some of them die off. Senile atrophy is death from age. Cells don't last forever. Sometimes they get old, they die. Disuse atrophy is when cells shrink because they aren't being used. So you think you go to the gym, you get really, buffed up, and then you spend like 4 years studying frantically, and you don't have time to go to the gym anymore, and what happens to your muscles? They shrink down. That's disuse atrophy. It also can happen in your brain, depending upon, what parts of your brain you're using. Some parts of your brain might start to atrophy and actually shrink. Necrosis is violent cell death. All right? This is when cells die due to some sort of trauma, toxins, or infections. So like if I take a baseball bat and go wailing on someone, that's going to cause necrosis. If I was to inject you with a strychnine toxin, that would cause necrosis. If you get infected with a Staph aureus infection and it starts killing your tissues, that's necrosis. Necrosis is traumatic. The cells die suddenly and they spill all of their guts into the surrounding area, and it's usually really bad for the surrounding tissue as well. Necrosis can be the result of an infarction. An infarction is where you have a set of tissue that suddenly dies because blood supply is cut off. So like a heart attack or a stroke, you have a sudden cutoff of blood flow. The cell starts to die because they don't have any oxygen. And when they die, they don't have any time to prepare. They're not atrophying. They're not dying through normal age or lack of use. They're dying because they ain't got no oxygen. And that's a sudden and severe lack of oxygen. A gangrene is tissue necrosis due to insufficient blood supply. This isn't like you don't have any blood, but it's like you don't have enough blood. And so the cells die slowly, one drip at a time. An example of a gangrene is a decubitus ulcer, or better known as a bed sore or a pressure sore. This is where you have somebody who's like bedridden and they can't move, and the same part of their body is constantly under pressure because they can't roll around. And what happens to them? Well, that pressure compresses the capillaries, less oxygen, less blood gets to that area. The tissue around it slowly starts to become malnourished and then die. And then when it dies, it necrosises, and that cuts off more blood flow as the dead tissue starts clotting things around there, and eventually it can get really, really nasty. In a dry gangrene, you don't have any bacteria involved. Tissue just shrinks and falls off. Decubitus ulcer is usually a dry gangrene. In a wet gangrene, this is caused by toxins or some sort of bacterial infection. and the tissue actually liquefies. This is something that happens with certain types of infections. Your internal organs just basically start to dissolve and turn into goo. A special bacterial infection, Clostridium, it causes gas gangrene, and this is because the bacteria produces hydrogen gas. The hydrogen gas basically displaces oxygen, starving the cells around it, and then they die. Apoptosis is cell suicide, and this is normal. This has been programmed into your cells. So your body needs to kill off some cells sometimes. Sometimes it's because those cells have gotten out of line and started doing something, like maybe they got infected. And sometimes it's just because to make room for a new set of tissue. In fact, your brain, you were born with way, way more neurons than you need. And part of the process of really fast learning when you are a young child and a baby is your brain sees what neurons are being used, and then it kills off all of the neurons that aren't being used in order to make way for the ones that are being used to enlarge and strengthen. So that's how you learn things early on. It's sort of like carving a sculpture. Like, in order to carve the sculpture, you have to get rid of the parts of the stone that aren't a part of the sculpture. You can use apoptosis, or your body uses apoptosis, to get rid of the cells that aren't a part of the final goal. Apoptosis is very untraumatic. The cell dies in a very well-organized fashion. It basically packs everything up. It takes apart all of its DNA, it packs up all of its membranes into nice little boxes, and then it just sort of dissolves into these nice little packages that macrophages can come by and eat and then recycle that material. So they're dying in a way that they can be recycled, turned into energy, turned into other organelles. That is perfectly normal, although it can also be a sign of infection. In summary, you need to know the types of tissue growth: hyperplasia, hypertrophy, neotrophy, etc., or neoplasia, etc., etc. You need to know what differentiation is and what stem cells are, and the types of stem cells: totipotent, pluripotent, multipotent, unipotent. You need to know what regeneration and fibrosis are. You need to know the 4 steps of tissue repair, and you need to know the differences between atrophy, necrosis, and apoptosis. All right. Thank you very much, and on to the next one.